What is landscape art? Landscape painting, also known as landscape art, is the depiction of landscapes in art, natural sceneries such as mountains, valleys, trees, rivers, and forests, especially where the main subject is a wide view, with its elements arranged into a coherent composition. Sky is almost always included in the view, and weather is often an element of the composition. Landscape art is typically described by what appears in the foreground, middle ground, and background. Landscape painting. We're going to just briefly do a history of the genre. But before we begin, we need to think about where does it lie? The roots of antiquity. Artists have been painting the landscape since ancient times. The Greeks and Romans created wall paintings of landscape and greenscapes. After the Roman Empire fell, the tradition of depicting pure landscapes declined, and the landscape was seen only as a setting for religious and figurative scenes. This tradition continued until the 16th century, when artists began to view the landscape as a subject in its own right. The artistic shift seemed to have corresponded to the growing interest in the natural world sparked by the Renaissance. The rise of the landscape in the Netherlands. The term landscape actually derives from the Dutch word landschap, which originally meant region, tract of land, but acquired the artistic connotation a picture depicting scenery on land in the early 1500s. The development of this term in the Netherlands at this time was logical because the Netherlands was one of the first places that landscape had become popular subject. It became a popular subject for painting. At this time, the rising Protestant middle class sought secular art for their homes, creating the need for new subjects to meet their tastes. Landscapes helped fill this need. We look here at the rise of the Netherlands, this image called Bridge with Sleuth by Jacob van Rustel. And this particular image is pretty fascinating. We look at it and we see the weather plays an important part. We see the foreground, we see the middle ground, and we see the background. And I know this picture is not the greatest, but it's actually so much better to see an image in real life. And here's our foreground, our middle ground, and our background. And you can see how the weather, the clouds, really played an important part of the landscape. Even landscapes became acceptable in the early 17th century. They were still often created merely as a setting for biblical, mythological, or historical scenes. So then we want to move on to the birth of classical landscape, and this one is called Landscape with a Calm by Nicholas Poussin, 1650 to 1651. The 17th century, the classical landscape was born. These landscapes were influenced by the classical antiquity and sought to illustrate the ideal landscape, recalling Arcadia, a legendary place in ancient Greece known for its quiet pastoral beauty. The Roman poet Virgil had described Arcadia as the home of pastoral simplicity. In classical landscape, the positioning of object was contrived. That means they just kind of put it wherever it fit for them. Every tree, every rock, every animal was carefully placed harmoniously in the image to make it balance and give it a timeless mood. So what happened after that? So here we have the Landscape of Calm by Nicholas Poussin, 1650 to 1651. Things started to acceptance in the academy. In the late 18th century, Pierre-Henri de Valenciennes changed the tide for landscape painting in France. Like Poussin, he saw landscape painting as worthy of the status of history painting and worked to convince the Academy and his contemporaries. In 1880, he published a groundbreaking book on landscape painting. The book emphasized the aesthetic ideal of the historical landscape, which must be based on the study of real nature. The success of the book pushed the Academy to create a prize for historical landscape paintings, and the next generation of French landscape painters were born. Then we have the modern landscape, and this is imagery that we are more familiar with because this is not currently in the time that we're living in, but we can relate to it because we've seen a lot of these images throughout our life. And the modern landscape, the 19th century, held many milestones for history of landscape art as the Industrial Revolution altered the traditions of rural life. The old hierarchy of subjects crumbled, and throughout Europe and North America, landscape painting gained new appreciation. And as we look at this artist, Vincent van Gogh, or actually the correct pronunciation is Vincent van Gogh, artists such as the Impressionists, they kind of started to make the studying of landscapes really important, and being outside, which is called plein air painting. So painting what you see outside. So this idea of doing artwork outside and kind of catching the essence of what is happening, just the impression of a landscape. Then we move on to American regionalism, and I threw this in here because this is a piece done by an artist named Grant Wood. And American regionalism is a realistic or modern art movement that included painting, murals, lithographs, and illustrations depicting realistic scenes of rural and small town America, primarily in the Midwest. And this guy, Grant Wood, was kind of the master at it. And you're probably going, I don't know who Grant Wood is, but you do once you see the image of American Gothic. Such a great, iconic image. So you can see here with Grant Wood's images of his regionalism art, and it falls into the landscape category. And then I thought I'd throw one of my images. This is my Aunt Tilda's farm I did, oh my gosh, about 15 years ago. And it was right after we sold the farm. So I thought this would be kind of fun for you all to see my photography in the 20th century landscape. In the early 20th century, painters continued to embrace the landscape as photography gained acceptance as an art form. Artists used the medium to create interpretations of the land through various effects, and later through formal compositions of close-ups, cropped views of landscape, and views of the landscape. In America, photographer Ansel Adams captured the country's attention with his breathtaking views of the wild beauty of the American West. Even though the major artistic movement of the mid-20th century were no longer dominated by the landscape as a subject, the genre's importance continued as artists responded to fears of increasing industrialization, the threat of global destruction, and ecological disasters. In the second half of the 20th century, the definition of landscape was challenged and pressed to include concepts like urban landscapes, cultural landscapes, industrial landscapes, and landscape architecture. Landscape photography continued to evolve and rise in popularity. American photographers like Robert Adams and William A. Garnett used the medium to raise awareness of conservation concerns. Today, the landscapes continues to be a subject artists turn to when contemplating the ways we relate to the place where we live and the impact we as humans have had on the land. There's Ansel Adams. Then we're going to move on to a photographer. His name is David Hockney. And what he did with the landscape is he created a photo montage. He combined multiple photographs to create one image for this landscape. This fixed point of view is mathematically explained of how we see it. It's a one-point perspective image. And the diminishing of color and intensity to lighter and duller hues gives the illusion of distance is called aerial perspective. So it's two types of landscapes when we look at one point versus aerial perspective. When we start thinking about what for us would make a good landscape. So there's one other person that we need to think about when we talk about the history of landscape painting, and we need to talk about George Morrison. George Morrison was an American landscape painter and sculptor. He was from northern Minnesota. He was born on the Grand Portage Reservation, and his Ojibwe name was Wawa Te Gone Gobu, standing in northern lights. I probably said that wrong, but George Morrison was a pivotal artist in the 20th century. So we're looking at his work, Dawn of the Sea. Most of his landscape paintings were reflections of Lake Superior. He was also known as an abstract expressionist. You can see here in this particular image, he's really broken down the landscape to a simpler form. And what George Morrison did was he played with all types of mediums. And you can see this one at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. And this one was all about beach things that he found on the shores of Lake Superior. And he created his landscapes in sculpture and in painting. This is one that he did towards the latter part of his life, and it's actually one of my favorite ones. It's called Spirit Path, New Day, Red Rock Variations, Lake Superior Landscape, 1990. You can see the variety of color that is used. It's almost glowing. And some days, if I'm a sailor on Lake Superior and there's this sailing, red sky at night, sailor's delight, red sky in the morn, sailors be warned. And it does have that eerie feeling to it. Which way are we going to go with the weather? It's a lovely painting. So our learning targets for this landscape is that you can compare and analyze landscapes and drawings, paintings from history, and we briefly touched on it. You know and understand the influence of Ojibwe landscape artist George Morrison. We briefly touched on him, and I encourage you to look at more of his artwork. He is an amazing artist and a Minnesotan. You are going to be able to develop a landscape drawing, and you'll create a landscape drawing and transfer it onto watercolor paper. You'll know and understand the vocabulary associated with landscapes and watercolor painting. You'll know how to use a variety of techniques to make a successful watercolor painting. You know how to respect the materials in art. And you will be using some personal landscape images. Please, no Google images. So you have some choices here. Remember, we watched a video on Dan Brueggemann, and he coined the phrase New World Landscapes. And I want you to make your own New World landscape. You can create a visual depiction like Dan by painting or sketching. You're going to be painting this, but it might be helpful to do your sketching and playing with some photographing, or of how you can create a modern New World landscape and kind of having the New World and the Old World collide, like you see in this particular image with the church being carried on the back of the semi-trailer. Super interesting. Or you paint a landscape from a photo that you or a family member have found. And I probably, oops, I screwed that up, but that's all right. Doesn't matter. So here's an image of me on my, off the side of my boat, looking and thinking about a landscape that I would like to paint. And hopefully you all received a postcard of this image just for fun to brighten your day. All right, so when you select your landscape, you need to make sure it has a foreground, it has a middle ground, and a background. Let's look at some student work. And I think it's always good to look at student work and to see what other people your age have done, your peers. And I really encourage you to use an image that you have at home that you've taken or a family member has taken, please no Google Images. Google Images will result in an F. But you want to have something as a guideline. I don't care if you take some creative license with all of this, but be mindful that you're using images that are original and that you're not plagiarizing or copying somebody else's work. And I think it's super interesting to see what others have done.